Let's start by understanding what makes mind control different from simple persuasion or influence. In everyday conversation, we try to convince people through logic, emotion, or shared values. We present our case and hope the other person agrees. But mind control goes deeper. It's not about winning an argument or changing an opinion. It's about reshaping how someone thinks, feels, and sees reality itself. Tonight, we'll explore 100 techniques that have been used throughout history to influence, manipulate, and control human behavior. We'll examine how these methods work, why they're so effective, and how they show up in relationships, workplaces, and society. Each technique we discuss isn't just theory. These are real methods that affect real people every day. Understanding these techniques isn't about learning to manipulate others. It's about recognition. It's about seeing the invisible threads that sometimes guide our thoughts and decisions. And once you can see them, you can choose whether to follow them or cut them loose. Let's begin with our first technique. 1. Gaslighting. Make someone doubt their own reality or memory. Gaslighting is perhaps one of the most insidious forms of psychological manipulation. At its core, it's about making someone question their own perception of reality. The name comes from a 1944 film called Gaslight, where a husband systematically manipulates his wife into believing she's losing her mind by dimming gaslights and then denying they're flickering. But gaslighting isn't just something that happens in movies. It's a real technique used to destabilize someone's confidence in their own memory, judgment, and sanity. The manipulator doesn't argue with facts directly. Instead, they attack the person's ability to perceive those facts correctly. It often starts with small denials. "I never said that. You're remembering it wrong. That didn't happen the way you think it did." These statements might seem harmless at first, especially if they're delivered calmly or with a tone of concern. But when they're repeated consistently, they begin to erode something fundamental: trust in one's own experience. The person being gaslighted starts to second-guess themselves. Did they really hear what they thought they heard? Are they being too sensitive? Are they imagining things? This self-doubt creates an opening for deeper manipulation. When someone no longer trusts their own perception, they become more dependent on others to tell them what's real. Gaslighting can happen in romantic relationships, where one partner consistently denies conversations that clearly took place. It can occur in families, where a parent rewrites history to avoid accountability. It shows up in workplaces, where managers deny giving instructions they clearly gave, leaving employees confused and questioning their competence. What makes gaslighting so effective is its subtlety. There's no obvious aggression, no clear attack. Just a gentle, persistent undermining of reality. The victim often doesn't realize what's happening until their confidence is already shaken. They may even start defending the gaslighter, believing they really are confused or overly emotional. The long-term effects can be devastating. People who experience sustained gaslighting often develop anxiety, depression, and a persistent fear of trusting their own judgment. They may isolate themselves from friends and family, afraid that others will also see them as unreliable or unstable. Understanding gaslighting means recognizing that your perceptions matter. Your memory isn't perfect, but it's yours. When someone consistently tells you that your experience of reality is wrong, especially when you know it isn't, that's not help. That's manipulation. And the first step in protecting yourself is trusting that what you experienced really happened, even when someone else insists it didn't. 2. Anchoring. Attach a mental state to a specific cue or gesture. Anchoring is a technique borrowed from neuroscience and psychology that creates powerful mental associations. The concept is simple. When someone is in a particular emotional or mental state, you introduce a specific stimulus, a touch, a word, a gesture, or even a sound. If this pairing is repeated enough times, the stimulus alone can trigger that same mental state later. Think about how certain songs can instantly transport you back to a specific moment in your life. Or how the smell of a particular perfume can flood you with memories of someone you once knew. These are natural anchors that formed without anyone deliberately creating them. But in the hands of someone who understands this process, anchoring becomes a tool for influence and control. The technique works because our brains are constantly creating associations. When we experience something pleasant while a specific cue is present, our mind links the two together. Later, when that cue appears again, our brain automatically recalls not just the memory, but the emotional state that went with it. In romantic relationships, someone might use anchoring by offering comfort during your moments of vulnerability while doing something specific, perhaps touching your shoulder in a particular way or using a certain tone of voice. Over time, that touch or tone becomes associated with feeling cared for and safe. Later, they can use that same anchor to make you feel dependent on them, even in situations where you should feel cautious or independent. In sales environments, skilled manipulators use anchoring constantly. They might shake your hand in a specific way while discussing something you clearly want, creating an association between their touch and feelings of desire or excitement. Later, when they want you to agree to something questionable, they use that same handshake to trigger those positive feelings. The workplace offers countless opportunities for anchoring. A supervisor might use a particular phrase or gesture while praising your work, creating an association between that cue and feelings of professional validation. Later, they can use that same cue to make you more agreeable to requests that aren't in your best interest. What makes anchoring particularly dangerous is that it often happens below conscious awareness. The person being anchored doesn't realize that their emotional responses are being systematically programmed. They just know that certain people or situations make them feel specific ways, without understanding why. Religious and political movements have used anchoring for centuries. Specific symbols, songs, or rituals are paired with feelings of belonging, purpose, or transcendence. Later, those same symbols can trigger intense loyalty and compliance, even when the associated actions or beliefs might otherwise seem questionable. The key to recognizing anchoring is paying attention to your emotional responses, especially when they seem disproportionate to the situation. If you find yourself feeling unusually positive or compliant around certain people, particularly when they use specific gestures or phrases, you might be responding to an anchor rather than the actual circumstances. Understanding anchoring doesn't mean becoming paranoid about every emotional response you have. Natural associations are a normal part of human experience. But when someone seems to have an unusual ability to trigger specific feelings in you, especially feelings that lead to decisions you later regret, it's worth examining whether they might be using this technique deliberately. 3. Love bombing. Overwhelm with affection to lower defenses. Love bombing is an intense strategy of overwhelming someone with excessive attention, affection, and adoration in order to influence their behavior and emotions. Unlike genuine affection, which develops naturally over time, love bombing is calculated and strategic. It's designed to create emotional dependency quickly by making the target feel special, desired, and deeply valued in ways they may have never experienced before. The technique begins with an avalanche of positive attention. Text messages arrive constantly throughout the day. Compliments are extravagant and frequent. Plans are made for the future almost immediately. Gifts appear without special occasions. The person being love-bombed often feels like they've found someone who truly gets them, someone who sees their worth in ways others haven't. This intensity serves a specific purpose. It lowers psychological defenses. When we're overwhelmed with positive attention, our critical thinking often decreases. We become less likely to question motives, notice red flags, or maintain healthy boundaries. The flood of good feelings creates a kind of emotional high that can be addictive, making us crave more of the same treatment. Love bombing often appears in the early stages of romantic relationships, but it's not limited to romance. It can occur in friendships, where someone suddenly becomes intensely interested in your life, showering you with attention and seeming to understand you perfectly. It happens in work environments, where a new boss or colleague overwhelming you with praise and special treatment before asking for things that cross professional boundaries. The pattern typically follows a cycle. First comes the bombing phase, intense, overwhelming positive attention that feels amazing but is actually too much, too fast. Then comes the devaluation phase, where that attention is gradually withdrawn. The person who was once showering you with affection becomes critical, distant, or emotionally unavailable. This creates confusion and desperation to return to that initial high. What makes love bombing so effective is that it exploits fundamental human needs for connection, validation, and love. Most people have experienced periods of loneliness, self-doubt, or feeling undervalued. When someone appears who seems to see all your best qualities and reflects them back to you intensely, it's natural to want to hold on to that feeling. The manipulator using this technique often studies their target first, learning what kind of attention they crave most. Someone who feels intellectually undervalued might be overwhelmed with praise for their intelligence. Someone who feels physically insecure might receive constant compliments about their appearance. The bombing is customized to hit the deepest insecurities and needs. Over time, this creates a trauma bond, a psychological attachment that forms between a person and someone who alternates between positive and negative treatment. The victim becomes addicted to the highs and increasingly willing to accept the lows, always hoping to return to that initial period of intense affection. Love bombing differs from genuine affection in several key ways. Genuine care develops gradually and consistently. It respects boundaries and doesn't demand immediate deep commitment. It doesn't suddenly disappear when you don't meet certain expectations. Most importantly, it doesn't make you feel like you have to earn or maintain it through specific behaviors. Recognizing love bombing means paying attention to the pace and intensity of someone's attention toward you. If someone seems to be putting you on a pedestal very quickly, claiming you're different from everyone else they've ever met, or making grand gestures that feel disproportionate to how long you've known each other, it's worth stepping back and asking whether this intensity is sustainable, and whether it's designed to influence your behavior in some way. Subliminal messaging. Embed commands below conscious awareness. Subliminal messaging operates in the shadows of consciousness, delivering information or commands that bypass your aware, thinking mind and speak directly to your subconscious. The word, subliminal, literally means below the threshold of conscious perception. These messages can be visual, appearing for fractions of a second, or auditory, hidden beneath other sounds or played at frequencies just outside normal hearing range. The power of subliminal messaging lies in its ability to influence thoughts, feelings, and behaviors without the target realizing they're being influenced at all. When your conscious mind processes information, it can analyze, question, and reject it. But when information reaches your subconscious directly, it often gets accepted without that critical filtering process. In advertising, subliminal techniques have been used for decades. Images might flash for milliseconds during commercials, too fast for conscious recognition but long enough for subconscious registration. Words might be embedded in visual designs, visible only when you know where to look. Sounds might be layered into background music at volumes just below conscious hearing. These techniques work because your subconscious mind is constantly processing far more information than your conscious mind can handle. While you're focused on the main message, the commercial, the conversation, the presentation, your subconscious is absorbing details, patterns, and suggestions you're not actively noticing. In personal manipulation, subliminal messaging might involve repeatedly exposing someone to specific words, images, or concepts in subtle ways. A manipulator might consistently use certain phrases in conversation, knowing that repetition below conscious awareness can plant ideas. They might arrange their environment to include symbols or reminders that reinforce specific thoughts or feelings. Digital environments offer particularly rich opportunities for subliminal influence. Website designs can include colors, shapes, and layouts that subconsciously encourage certain behaviors. Social media algorithms can gradually expose you to increasingly extreme viewpoints, shifting your perspective so slowly that you don't notice the change. Even the timing of when certain content appears can influence how you respond to it. The effectiveness of subliminal messaging varies from person to person and depends on factors like current emotional state, existing beliefs, and level of mental fatigue. People who are stressed, tired, or emotionally vulnerable are often more susceptible to subliminal influence because their conscious mental defenses are weakened. One particularly concerning application involves audio recordings that claim to provide self-improvement benefits while actually containing hidden suggestions. Someone might listen to what they think is a relaxation tape, not knowing it contains subliminal commands designed to increase compliance, reduce critical thinking, or create emotional dependency on the person who provided the recording. In group settings, subliminal messaging might involve the strategic use of symbols, colors, or background sounds that create specific psychological atmospheres. Meeting rooms might be designed with colors that subconsciously encourage agreement. Music might be chosen not just for its obvious effects, but for subliminal frequencies that influence mood and decision-making. The challenge with subliminal messaging is that, by definition, it's difficult to detect consciously. However, there are some strategies for protection. Paying attention to your emotional and mental state changes, especially when they seem to occur without clear cause, can help you identify when you might be under subliminal influence. Also, being aware of your environment and questioning why certain design choices, music selections, or repeated phrases are being used can help you spot potential subliminal manipulation. If someone seems unusually interested in controlling your media consumption, environment, or the specific wording they use around you, it's worth considering whether they might be using techniques designed to influence you below conscious awareness. Understanding subliminal messaging isn't about becoming paranoid about every advertisement or conversation. It's about recognizing that influence can operate below conscious awareness and developing the habit of occasionally stepping back to examine whether your thoughts, feelings, and decisions are truly your own or whether they might be shaped by forces you haven't consciously recognized. 5. Fear-mongering. Instill fear to drive compliance. Fear-mongering is the deliberate cultivation of fear to manipulate behavior and decision-making. Unlike legitimate warnings about real dangers, fear-mongering involves either exaggerating genuine threats or creating entirely fabricated ones for the purpose of control. The technique works because fear is one of our most primitive and powerful emotions, often overriding rational thought and leading to impulsive compliance with whoever claims to offer protection. At its core, fear-mongering exploits our natural survival instincts. When we perceive danger, our brain's fight or flight response kicks in, flooding our system with stress hormones that prepare us for immediate action. This response evolved to help us survive genuine physical threats, but it can be triggered by psychological and social fears as well. When someone is in this heightened state, they are more likely to accept solutions without critical analysis. The process typically follows a predictable pattern. First, a threat is identified and amplified. This might be a genuine issue that's blown out of proportion, or it might be a completely manufactured danger. The key is to make the threat feel immediate, personal, and overwhelming. Next, the fear-monger positions themselves as the only reliable source of protection or solution. Finally, they demand compliance, loyalty, or resources in exchange for that protection. In personal relationships, fear-mongering might involve convincing someone that the outside world is dangerous and that only the manipulator can provide safety. They might constantly point out potential threats, dangerous people, risky situations, unreliable friends, gradually convincing their target that isolation and dependence are forms of protection rather than control. Workplace fear-mongering often revolves around job security. A manipulative manager might constantly remind employees how difficult the job market is, how lucky they are to have their position, and how easily they could be replaced. This creates a climate of fear that makes employees more willing to accept poor treatment, longer hours, or unethical requests rather than risk losing their livelihood. In larger social contexts, fear-mongering has been used throughout history to justify everything from persecution of minority groups to unnecessary wars. The pattern is always similar. Identify a group or situation to fear, amplify that fear through repetition and emotional appeals, then demand support for actions that benefit the fearmonger while claiming they're necessary for protection. What makes fear-mongering particularly effective is that it often contains just enough truth to seem credible. The world does contain genuine dangers, job markets can be competitive, and some people do have malicious intentions. Fearmongers take these real concerns and amplify them beyond reasonable proportion, making it difficult to distinguish between legitimate caution and manufactured panic. The technique also exploits our tendency to remember negative information more vividly than positive information. Once someone has planted fearful thoughts in your mind, they tend to stick around and influence your perception of future events. You start noticing more potential threats, which seems to confirm that the original warnings were justified. Fear-mongering often includes time pressure, the suggestion that danger is imminent and that immediate action is required. This prevents careful consideration and encourages impulsive compliance. "If you don't do this now, it'll be too late," is a common refrain that bypasses rational analysis by creating artificial urgency. The antidote to fear-mongering involves several strategies. First, when someone presents you with information designed to make you afraid, take time to verify that information independently. Fearmongers often discourage independent research, claiming that other sources are unreliable or biased. Second, pay attention to who benefits from your fear. If the person warning you about dangers is also the one offering to protect you, especially if that protection requires giving up autonomy, resources, or relationships, their motives are worth questioning. Finally, remember that legitimate warnings about genuine dangers usually include practical information about how to assess and manage risk yourself. Fear-mongering, by contrast, typically presents threats as overwhelming and unmanageable without the manipulator's help. Understanding fear-mongering doesn't mean ignoring real dangers or becoming recklessly overconfident. It means developing the ability to distinguish between genuine warnings and manufactured fears, and maintaining your capacity for independent judgment even when you're feeling anxious or threatened. 6. Scarcity principle. Create urgency by highlighting limited time or quantity. The scarcity principle is built on a simple psychological truth. We tend to value things more when we believe they're rare or running out. This isn't necessarily rational behavior, but it's deeply human. When something appears scarce, our brain interprets that scarcity as a signal of value, desirability, or importance. Manipulators exploit this tendency by artificially creating or exaggerating scarcity to drive compliance and decision-making. The technique works because scarcity triggers what psychologists call loss aversion, our tendency to feel the pain of losing something more intensely than the pleasure of gaining it. When we're told that an opportunity is limited, we don't just think about what we might gain by taking it. We focus on what we might lose by missing it. That fear of loss often overrides careful consideration of whether we actually need or want what's being offered. In retail environments, artificial scarcity is everywhere. Only 3 left in stock messages on websites, limited time offers that seem to extend indefinitely, exclusive products that aren't actually exclusive. These are all applications of the scarcity principle. The goal isn't to provide accurate information about availability. It's to create psychological pressure that leads to immediate purchasing decisions. But scarcity manipulation extends far beyond shopping. In personal relationships, someone might suggest that your connection with them is rare and irreplaceable. "You'll never find anyone who understands you like I do," or, "What we have is special." Most people never experience this. These statements create artificial emotional scarcity, making you fear that leaving the relationship means losing something you'll never find again. Workplace manipulators often use career-based scarcity. "This kind of opportunity doesn't come around often," or, "If you don't take this promotion, we might not have another opening for years." They create the impression that saying no means missing out on something that won't be available again, even when similar opportunities might appear regularly. In social situations, scarcity can involve access to information, inclusion in groups, or special treatment. Someone might share insider knowledge with you, emphasizing how few people have access to this information. The scarcity of the information makes it feel more valuable, even if the information itself isn't particularly useful or accurate. Time-based scarcity is particularly powerful because it adds urgency to the equation. "This offer expires at midnight," or, "You need to decide by Friday." The time pressure prevents careful consideration and encourages impulsive compliance. Often, these deadlines are entirely artificial. The offer could continue indefinitely, but the deadline creates psychological pressure to act quickly. What makes scarcity manipulation especially effective is that it often bypasses rational analysis. When we're focused on not missing out, we spend less mental energy evaluating whether we actually want what's being offered. The scarcity itself becomes the primary reason for action, rather than the inherent value of the opportunity. Digital environments have made scarcity manipulation more sophisticated. Websites can display real-time counters showing how many people are viewing a product, how many items are left, or how much time remains in a sale. These displays create a sense of competition and urgency, even when the numbers might be fabricated or manipulated. Social media platforms use scarcity through features like stories that disappear after 24 hours, limited time filters, or exclusive access to certain features. The temporary nature of these offerings makes them feel more valuable and encourages frequent engagement to avoid missing out. The key to recognizing scarcity manipulation is asking yourself whether the urgency you're feeling matches the actual importance of the decision. Legitimate scarcity usually involves clear, verifiable reasons why something is limited. Manufactured scarcity often involves vague statements about limited availability without specific explanations. Also, pay attention to how often someone uses scarcity language. If every offer, opportunity, or request comes with urgent time pressure or claims of limited availability, you're likely dealing with someone who uses scarcity as a standard manipulation technique rather than someone reporting genuine limitations. Understanding the scarcity principle doesn't mean ignoring all time-sensitive opportunities or limited offers. Some things genuinely are scarce or time-limited, but it does mean maintaining the ability to step back and evaluate whether the scarcity you're feeling is based on real limitations or psychological manipulation designed to override your careful judgment. 7. Foot in the door. Start with a small request, then escalate. The foot-in-the-door technique is a gradual escalation strategy that begins with small, reasonable requests and progressively builds to larger ones that might have been rejected if asked directly. The name comes from door-to-door salespeople who knew that getting someone to open the door, even slightly, dramatically increased their chances of making a sale. Once that initial barrier is crossed, each subsequent request becomes easier to accept. This technique works because of something psychologists call commitment and consistency bias. Once we agree to something small, we tend to view ourselves as the kind of person who says yes to that type of request. To maintain consistency with this self-image, we become more likely to agree to similar but larger requests later. We don't want to see ourselves as inconsistent or hypocritical, so we continue saying yes even as the requests grow beyond what we're comfortable with. The process is usually so gradual that the target doesn't notice how far they've moved from their original boundaries. Each step feels like a small extension of what they've already agreed to, rather than a significant new commitment. By the time they realize how much they've agreed to, they've already invested enough time, energy, or resources that backing out feels wasteful or embarrassing. In personal relationships, this might begin with small favors that seem harmless and reasonable. "Could you pick me up from work today?" leads to, "Could you drive me to appointments this week?" which eventually becomes an expectation that you'll provide transportation whenever needed. Each individual request seems manageable, but collectively they represent a significant shift in the relationship dynamic. The technique is particularly common in abusive relationships, where boundaries are eroded gradually over time. It might start with requests to spend more time together, then progress to suggestions about changing your appearance, then demands to cut contact with certain friends, and eventually escalate to complete social isolation. Each step is presented as reasonable given what you've already agreed to. In sales contexts, foot in the door might involve getting customers to agree to small commitments first. A gym membership salesperson might start by asking if you'd like to try a free workout, then suggest signing up for a free week, then offer a short-term trial membership, gradually building toward a long-term contract that includes additional services you didn't originally want. Workplace manipulation often uses this pattern as well. A manager might start by asking you to stay a few minutes late to finish a project, then request that you work through lunch occasionally, then expect regular overtime, eventually creating a culture where excessive work hours become normalized. Each request builds on the previous ones, making refusal seem inconsistent with your established pattern of helpfulness. Political and social movements sometimes use foot-in-the-door techniques to gradually increase member commitment. Someone might be asked to attend a meeting, then to volunteer for a small task, then to recruit friends, then to donate money, then to take increasingly extreme actions. The progression is designed to gradually shift the person's identity and commitments without triggering resistance. Online platforms use digital versions of this technique. They might ask for minimal information to create an account, then request additional personal details to improve your experience, then ask for access to your contacts, then permission to send notifications, gradually gaining more control over your attention and data than you initially intended to provide. What makes foot in the door particularly insidious is that each individual step often seems reasonable in isolation. The manipulator isn't asking for everything at once, which would trigger natural resistance. Instead, they're creating a pathway of small agreements that leads to major commitments. The technique also exploits our natural tendency to avoid confrontation. Saying no to a small request can feel petty or unreasonable, especially if we've said yes to similar requests before. We might agree to things we don't really want to do simply to avoid the discomfort of setting boundaries. Recognizing foot-in-the-door manipulation involves paying attention to patterns rather than individual requests. If someone consistently follows your agreement to one thing with requests for increasingly larger commitments, and if you find yourself agreeing to things you never thought you would, you might be experiencing this technique. The key defense is maintaining awareness of your overall boundaries and commitments, not just the immediate request. Before agreeing to anything, consider where it might lead and whether you're comfortable with that trajectory. It's also important to remember that saying no to a new request isn't inconsistent with previous agreements. It's simply recognizing that your boundaries have been reached. Understanding this technique doesn't mean becoming suspicious of every small request or never helping anyone. But it does mean maintaining the right to evaluate each new commitment independently, regardless of what you've agreed to before. 8. Authority bias. Present yourself as an expert to gain unquestioning obedience. Authority bias is our tendency to comply with requests and accept information from people we perceive as authorities, often without critical evaluation. This isn't always problematic. Following legitimate expertise can save time and prevent dangerous mistakes. But when someone manufactures authority or uses legitimate authority inappropriately, this natural tendency becomes a tool for manipulation and control. The power of authority bias runs deep in human psychology. From childhood, we're taught to listen to parents, teachers, and other authority figures. This conditioning serves important social functions, but it also creates vulnerability. When someone appears to be an authority, many people automatically shift into a more compliant mental state, asking fewer questions and offering less resistance to requests or commands. Manufactured authority can take many forms. Someone might claim credentials they don't possess, exaggerate their expertise, or present themselves as more knowledgeable than they actually are. They might use impressive-sounding titles, display fake diplomas, or reference relationships with real experts to boost their perceived credibility. The goal is to trigger authority bias without actually earning legitimate authority through knowledge, skill, or position. In personal relationships, authority manipulation might involve one person positioning themselves as more knowledgeable about psychology, relationships, or life in general. They might constantly reference books they've read, courses they've taken, or insights they've gained, gradually establishing themselves as the relationship expert whose judgment shouldn't be questioned. This manufactured expertise then becomes justification for making decisions that affect both people. Professional environments offer rich opportunities for authority manipulation. Someone might claim expertise they don't possess, name-drop connections to impressive people, or use technical jargon to sound more knowledgeable than they are. They might also exploit legitimate authority inappropriately, using their position to gain compliance in areas outside their actual expertise. The technique becomes particularly dangerous when combined with other manipulation methods. An authority figure might use their perceived expertise to gaslight someone, claiming that the target's perceptions are wrong because, as an expert, I can tell you that's not how it works. The authority status makes their version of reality seem more credible, even when it contradicts direct experience. Visual symbols of authority are often exploited as well. White coats make people appear more medical, suits suggest business expertise, and academic settings imply intellectual authority. Manipulators might carefully stage their environment to include books, certificates, awards, or other symbols that suggest expertise, even when those symbols are irrelevant to the situation at hand. Online environments have created new opportunities for authority manipulation. Someone might create impressive-looking websites, accumulate large social media followings, or generate fake testimonials to appear more credible. The digital format makes it easier to manufacture evidence of expertise while making verification more difficult. Authority bias also explains why people often comply with unreasonable requests when they come from perceived experts. In famous psychological experiments, people were willing to administer what they believed were dangerous electric shocks simply because someone in a lab coat told them to continue. The authority figure's presence overrode their natural reluctance to harm others. What makes authority bias particularly problematic is that it often shuts down critical thinking entirely. When we perceive someone as an authority, we tend to focus on compliance rather than evaluation. We might not ask the questions we would normally ask or apply the skepticism we would usually maintain. The bias is also self-reinforcing. Once someone establishes themselves as an authority in your mind, their subsequent statements seem more credible simply because they're coming from a perceived expert. This can create a spiral where initial false authority claims lead to increased credibility for future claims. Recognizing authority manipulation involves examining both the source and the content of information or requests. Real expertise usually comes with specific, verifiable credentials and a willingness to have claims examined and challenged. Manufactured authority often involves vague claims about experience, reluctance to provide specific evidence, and discouragement of independent verification. It's also worth paying attention to scope. Even legitimate authorities have limits to their expertise. A medical doctor isn't automatically an expert on relationships, a successful businessperson isn't necessarily qualified to give life advice, and someone with academic credentials in one field may not understand others. The key to maintaining healthy skepticism while still respecting legitimate expertise is asking questions. Real experts welcome questions about their qualifications, methods, and reasoning. They can explain their conclusions in terms you can understand and point you toward ways to verify their claims independently. Authority manipulators, by contrast, often discourage questions and frame skepticism as disrespect or ignorance. Understanding authority bias doesn't mean rejecting all expertise or becoming cynical about credentials. But it does mean maintaining your right to understand and evaluate the information you're given, regardless of who's giving it to you. 9. Future pacing. Get someone to imagine themselves following your advice. Future pacing is a psychological technique that involves guiding someone to visualize themselves in a future scenario where they've already taken the action you want them to take. Instead of directly arguing for a decision or trying to convince through logic, the manipulator helps the target mentally rehearse the desired outcome, making it feel familiar, achievable, and appealing. This mental rehearsal often translates into actual behavior because the brain has difficulty distinguishing between vividly imagined experiences and real ones. The technique works by leveraging the power of visualization in mental practice. When we imagine ourselves doing something in detail, our brain creates neural pathways similar to those formed by actually performing the action. This mental rehearsal makes the imagined behavior feel more natural and likely when the real opportunity arises. Athletes use this principle positively when they visualize successful performances, but in manipulation, it's used to guide people toward decisions that benefit the manipulator. Future pacing often begins with phrases like, "Imagine how you'll feel when," or "Picture yourself 6 months from now after you've." The manipulator then guides the target through a detailed mental scenario that assumes they've already made the desired choice and are experiencing positive results. This creates emotional investment in an outcome that hasn't happened yet and may not even be realistic. In sales situations, future pacing might involve having a customer visualize themselves using a product and experiencing its benefits. A car salesperson might say, "Picture yourself driving this car to work every day, feeling confident and comfortable, knowing you made a smart choice." This mental rehearsal makes the purchase feel like it's already happened and frames not buying as giving up something the person has already experienced in their imagination. In personal relationships, future pacing can be used to manipulate major life decisions. Someone might guide their partner through detailed scenarios of what their life will be like after marriage, after moving to a new city, or after making other significant changes. By making these futures feel vivid and real, they increase the likelihood that the partner will make decisions that align with those visualized scenarios, even if the partner hadn't originally wanted those outcomes. The technique is particularly powerful when combined with emotional manipulation. The future scenarios aren't just described. They're loaded with emotional content designed to make the imagined future feel deeply desirable or necessary. Think about how proud your parents will be when you graduate from this program, or imagine how secure you'll feel knowing you have this financial protection. Future pacing also exploits our natural tendency to commit to consistency with our stated intentions. Once someone has vividly imagined themselves taking a particular action and experiencing positive results, not taking that action can feel like giving up on their own expressed desires. The manipulator frames inaction as betraying the future self that the person has already visualized. Religious and political movements often use future pacing to increase commitment and compliance. Members are guided through detailed visualizations of the better world they're working toward, the personal transformation they'll experience, or the rewards they'll receive for their dedication. These mental rehearsals create emotional investment in outcomes that may be unrealistic or indefinitely delayed. In therapeutic contexts, future pacing can be used positively to help people visualize recovery or positive change. But in manipulative contexts, it's used to guide people toward decisions that primarily benefit the manipulator. The key difference lies in whose interests the visualized future serves and whether the person has genuine choice in the matter. What makes future pacing particularly effective is that it feels collaborative rather than controlling. The manipulator isn't telling you what to do, they're helping you explore what you want. This framing reduces resistance and makes the influence feel like self-discovery rather than external pressure. The technique also creates a form of premature closure. By visualizing a specific future in detail, other possibilities begin to seem less real or desirable. The person becomes mentally committed to one path before fully exploring alternatives, reducing their likelihood of making truly independent decisions. Recognizing future pacing involves paying attention to when conversations shift from discussing current reality to elaborately detailing specific future scenarios. While positive visualization can be helpful for personal goal setting, it becomes manipulative when someone else is consistently guiding your mental rehearsals in directions that serve their interests rather than yours. The antidote to manipulative future pacing is maintaining awareness that visualization is just one tool for decision-making, not a commitment to action. It's also important to consciously explore multiple possible futures, not just the one someone else is encouraging you to imagine. Understanding this technique means recognizing that while imagining positive outcomes can be motivating, decisions should be based on current reality, values, and careful consideration of actual options, not just the most vivid or emotionally appealing scenario someone has helped you visualize. 10. Hypnotic induction. Guide someone into a trance state for deep suggestion. Hypnotic induction is the process of guiding someone into an altered state of consciousness where they become more suggestible and less critical in their thinking. While hypnosis has legitimate therapeutic applications, it can also be used manipulatively to bypass normal psychological defenses and implant ideas, beliefs, or behaviors that serve the hypnotist's purposes rather than the subject's well-being. The hypnotic state isn't sleep or unconsciousness. It's actually a heightened state of focused attention combined with relaxed critical thinking. In this state, the conscious mind becomes less active in filtering and analyzing incoming information, while the subconscious becomes more receptive to suggestions. This creates an opportunity for ideas to be planted directly without going through normal skeptical evaluation. Traditional hypnotic induction often involves progressive relaxation, rhythmic speaking patterns, and focused attention on specific objects or concepts. The hypnotist might guide the subject through detailed relaxation exercises, use repetitive language patterns, or employ techniques like having the subject focus on a swinging pendulum or fixed point. These methods gradually shift the person's consciousness from active awareness to passive receptivity. But hypnotic induction doesn't require formal hypnosis sessions or obvious trance states. Many of the same principles can be applied in normal conversation through what's called conversational hypnosis or covert hypnosis. This might involve using specific language patterns, creating confusion or mental overload, or exploiting moments when someone's conscious defenses are naturally lowered. Rhythmic, repetitive speech patterns can induce trance-like states even in casual conversation. Someone might speak in a steady, measured cadence while repeating key phrases or concepts. This repetition, combined with a soothing vocal tone, can gradually shift the listener into a more suggestible state without them realizing it's happening. Confusion techniques are another form of covert induction. By presenting complex, contradictory, or overwhelming information, a manipulator can overload someone's conscious processing capacity. When the analytical mind becomes overwhelmed trying to make sense of confusing input, it may temporarily shut down, creating an opening for suggestions to bypass critical evaluation. Physical relaxation and comfort are often used to facilitate hypnotic states. Someone might offer massage, suggest comfortable seating, or create an environment that naturally leads to physical and mental relaxation. These seemingly caring gestures actually serve to lower psychological defenses and increase suggestibility. Hypnotic language patterns include specific techniques like embedded commands, where suggestions are hidden within normal conversation. Instead of directly saying, "You should trust me," someone might say, "I think it's important for people to be able to trust completely when they meet someone who truly understands them." The command to trust is embedded within a seemingly innocent observation. Time distortion is another element of hypnotic manipulation. Extended conversations that seem to flow naturally but actually last much longer than normal can create mental fatigue and increased suggestibility. The subject loses track of time and enters a kind of conversational trance where they become more accepting of ideas and suggestions. Religious and spiritual contexts often employ hypnotic techniques, sometimes deliberately and sometimes accidentally. Repetitive chanting, rhythmic music, prolonged rituals, and charismatic speaking can all induce trance-like states where participants become more receptive to spiritual or ideological suggestions. Group settings can amplify hypnotic effects through social pressure and shared focus. When multiple people are experiencing similar altered states simultaneously, the collective energy can deepen individual susceptibility to suggestion and reduce critical thinking even further. What makes hypnotic manipulation particularly dangerous is that subjects often remember the experience as entirely voluntary. Because the conscious mind is relaxed rather than completely shut down, people typically recall agreeing with the suggestions they received. They may not realize that their agreement came from an artificially induced state of heightened suggestibility. The effects can be long-lasting because suggestions received in hypnotic states often bypass normal critical evaluation and get stored directly as beliefs or behavioral patterns. Someone might find themselves thinking, feeling, or acting in ways that align with suggestions they received while in a trance state, without connecting those changes to the hypnotic influence. Recognizing hypnotic manipulation involves paying attention to your mental state during interactions. If you find yourself feeling unusually relaxed, confused, or compliant during conversations, especially ones that involve repetitive language or complex explanations, you might be experiencing covert induction attempts. It's also worth noticing when someone seems particularly interested in your comfort, relaxation, or mental state, especially if they're simultaneously making suggestions or requests. While genuine care is normal in healthy relationships, excessive focus on inducing relaxation or altered states can be a red flag for manipulative intent. Understanding hypnotic induction doesn't mean becoming paranoid about every relaxing conversation or dismissing legitimate therapeutic hypnosis. But it does mean maintaining awareness that your state of consciousness affects your decision-making capacity and that some people may deliberately try to alter that state for their own benefit rather than yours. 11. False choices. Offer only the options you want them to pick. False choices, also known as the false dilemma or false dichotomy, is a manipulation technique where someone presents a limited set of options while concealing the fact that other alternatives exist. The manipulator frames the situation as if you must choose between the options they've provided, when in reality, you may have many more choices available, including the option to not choose at all. This technique works because humans naturally try to be helpful and accommodating when presented with what seems like a reasonable request for decision-making. When someone asks you to choose between A and B, your mind automatically begins evaluating those two options rather than questioning whether A and B represent all the possibilities. The false choice creates a mental tunnel that focuses your attention on the manipulator's preferred alternatives while hiding other paths. In romantic relationships, false choices might sound like, "Do you want to spend the evening together, or do you not care about our relationship?" This presents only two options: compliance or relationship damage. It conceals other possibilities like spending time together later, doing something different together, or having legitimate reasons for needing time alone that don't reflect relationship priorities. Workplace false choices are common in environments where managers want to appear collaborative while still controlling outcomes. "Would you prefer to work late tonight or come in early tomorrow?" assumes that extra work is necessary and that these are the only two ways to handle it. It doesn't acknowledge that the deadline might be flexible, that additional resources could be provided, or that the extra work might not actually be required. Sales environments frequently use false choices to guide purchasing decisions. "Would you prefer the red car or the blue car?" assumes you've already decided to buy a car from that particular dealer. "Do you want to pay monthly or annually?" assumes you've decided to buy the product at all. These questions bypass the fundamental choice of whether to make any purchase. Parental manipulation often relies on false choices to maintain control while appearing to offer autonomy. "Do you want to clean your room now or after dinner?" presents the illusion of choice while ensuring the room gets cleaned. While this might be reasonable in a parent-child relationship, the same pattern becomes problematic when used to manipulate adults. Political false choices are used to polarize public opinion and discourage nuanced thinking. "You're either with us or against us" eliminates the possibility of partial agreement, conditional support, or alternative approaches. This binary framing forces people into camps while concealing the reality that most complex issues have multiple valid perspectives and solutions. In group dynamics, false choices can be used to manufacture consensus while suppressing dissent. Should we implement Plan A immediately or take a few more days to refine it? This appears to offer choice but assumes that some version of Plan A will definitely be implemented. It doesn't acknowledge that Plan A might be fundamentally flawed or that entirely different approaches might be better. Digital interfaces often use false choices to guide user behavior. Allow notifications, or Ask Me Later, presents only two options, concealing the fact that you can usually disable notifications entirely through settings. Subscribe Now, or Continue with limited access, frames the choice as temporary inconvenience versus permanent benefit, hiding other alternatives. What makes false choices particularly effective is that they often include one obviously undesirable option alongside the manipulator's preferred choice. Do you want to help with this project, or should I tell everyone you're not a team player? The second option is so unappealing that the first choice seems reasonable by comparison, even if helping with the project isn't actually in your best interest. The technique also exploits our natural desire to be decisive and helpful. When someone presents us with choices, we often feel obligated to pick one of them rather than questioning whether the choices themselves are appropriate or complete. This social pressure to choose can override careful consideration of whether we want to participate in the decision at all. Time pressure is frequently combined with false choices to prevent careful analysis. We need to decide right now, do you want option A or option B? The urgency discourages you from stepping back to consider whether other alternatives exist or whether an immediate decision is actually necessary. Recognizing false choices requires developing the habit of asking, what other options might be available, before committing to any of the presented alternatives. Often, the best choice is one that wasn't offered, or the choice not to choose at all until you have more information or better alternatives. It's also worth paying attention to how choices are framed. If the options seem designed to guide you toward a particular outcome, or if one choice is obviously undesirable while the other serves someone else's interests, you might be experiencing a false choice situation. The antidote to false choice manipulation is expanding your awareness of alternatives before making decisions. This might mean asking for time to consider other possibilities, consulting with others who aren't invested in the outcome, or simply stating that you don't accept the limited options being presented. Understanding false choices doesn't mean becoming indecisive or rejecting every set of alternatives offered to you. Sometimes there genuinely are only a few viable options. But it does mean maintaining your right to explore alternatives beyond what others present to you and recognizing when apparent choices are actually forms of control. 12. Social proof. Suggest everyone else is already doing it. Social proof is a psychological principle that makes us more likely to take an action when we believe others, especially people similar to us, are already taking that same action. This tendency evolved as a useful shortcut for decision making. If everyone else is doing something, it's often safe and beneficial to follow along. But manipulators exploit this natural inclination by fabricating or exaggerating evidence that others are already complying with their requests. The power of social proof lies in our fundamental need to belong and our natural assumption that groups possess collective wisdom we might lack individually. When we're uncertain about what to do, seeing what others have chosen provides a sense of direction and reduces the anxiety of making potentially wrong decisions. Manipulators understand this and create artificial social proof to guide behavior in directions that serve their interests. In sales contexts, social proof might involve testimonials from satisfied customers, claims about popularity, our best-selling item, or statements about what most people choose. Online, this translates into customer reviews, social media followers, or notifications about how many other people are viewing the same product. The goal is to make you feel like you're joining a crowd of smart decision makers rather than being sold to. But these indicators can be easily fabricated. Fake reviews, purchased followers, artificially inflated view counts, and staged testimonials create the appearance of social proof without the underlying reality. Even genuine social proof can be misleading if it's presented selectively, highlighting positive responses while hiding negative ones, or focusing on irrelevant groups that don't actually represent your situation. In personal relationships, social proof manipulation might sound like, all of my previous partners were fine with this arrangement, or, everyone else in our friend group thinks you're being unreasonable. These statements are designed to make you feel isolated in your perspective and pressure you to conform to what appears to be group consensus, even when that consensus may not exist or may not be relevant to your situation. Workplace environments often use social proof to encourage longer hours, acceptance of poor conditions, or compliance with questionable practices. Everyone stays late here, or, most people don't mind working weekends for important projects. These statements create pressure to match what appears to be standard behavior, even when that behavior might be harmful to work-life balance or personal well-being. Cult and high-control groups rely heavily on manufactured social proof to maintain member compliance. New recruits are shown how happy and committed existing members appear to be, how successful the group's methods have been for others, and how many people have found meaning through participation. This apparent consensus makes questioning the group's practices feel not just wrong, but lonely and isolating. Social media platforms amplify social proof effects through features like likes, shares, and comments. These metrics create the appearance that certain ideas, products, or behaviors have widespread approval, even when the engagement might be artificially generated or represent only a small, unrepresentative sample of users. Political movements use social proof through rally attendance, petition signatures, and claims about growing support. Millions of people agree with us, or, this movement is spreading everywhere. These assertions make individual dissent feel not just wrong but futile, as if you're opposing an unstoppable tide of popular opinion. What makes social proof manipulation particularly insidious is that it often contains elements of truth. Some people probably are doing what the manipulator claims, some customers might genuinely be satisfied, and some groups might actually support certain positions. The manipulation lies in the selective presentation and exaggeration of this evidence to create pressure for conformity. The technique also exploits our natural cognitive shortcuts. Evaluating every decision independently requires significant mental energy, so we often look to others for guidance. This shortcut usually works well, but it creates vulnerability when the social proof we're seeing has been deliberately manufactured or distorted. Bandwagon effects amplify social proof manipulation. Once some people begin following what appears to be popular behavior, their participation becomes genuine evidence that others can point to, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. What started as manufactured consensus can eventually become real consensus, even if the original reasons for the behavior were based on false information. Recognizing social proof manipulation involves asking questions about the evidence being presented. Who exactly are these other people who are supposedly doing this? How do you know they're doing it? Are they similar enough to you that their choices should influence yours? Is the evidence verifiable through independent sources? It's also worth considering whether you're being pressured to act quickly based on what others are supposedly doing. Genuine social proof doesn't usually come with urgent time pressure. If someone is using others' behavior to push you toward immediate action, the social proof might be manufactured to override your careful consideration. Understanding social proof doesn't mean ignoring what others do or becoming completely isolated in your decision-making. Others' experiences and choices can provide valuable information, but it does mean maintaining the ability to verify that social proof independently and to make decisions based on your own values and circumstances rather than just following what appears to be popular. The key is distinguishing between genuine social proof, real evidence about what others are doing and why, and manufactured social proof designed to pressure you into compliance with someone else's agenda. 13. Emotional triggering. Use words that spark strong emotions. Emotional triggering is the deliberate use of specific words, phrases, or concepts designed to provoke intense emotional reactions that bypass rational thinking. When someone is in the grip of strong emotions, whether anger, fear, excitement, or sadness, their ability to think critically and make careful decisions becomes significantly impaired. Manipulators exploit this by strategically choosing language that triggers these emotional states when they want to influence behavior or thinking. The technique works because emotions and rational thought operate through different brain systems, and intense emotions can effectively override logical analysis. When your emotional brain is highly activated, your analytical brain takes a backseat. In this state, you're more likely to accept suggestions, make impulsive decisions, or agree to requests that you would normally reject after careful consideration. Emotional triggers are highly personal and often rooted in past experiences, deep-seated fears, or core values. Skilled manipulators learn to identify what specific words or concepts provoke strong reactions in their targets, then use this knowledge strategically. They might discover that someone has strong reactions to words related to abandonment, failure, injustice, or success, then weave these triggers into conversations when they want compliance. In personal relationships, emotional triggering might involve deliberately bringing up topics that the manipulator knows will upset their target. If someone has insecurities about their appearance, intelligence, or past mistakes, a manipulator might make subtle references to these sensitive areas when they want to destabilize the person's confidence and make them more dependent or agreeable. The triggers don't have to be negative. Positive emotional triggers can be equally effective for manipulation. Words and concepts related to love, success, recognition, or belonging can create euphoric states that make someone more likely to agree to requests or overlook red flags. Someone might use phrases like soulmate, once in a lifetime opportunity, or you're so special to trigger positive emotions that override careful judgment. Political rhetoric frequently employs emotional triggering to mobilize support or opposition. Words like freedom, justice, threat, or crisis are chosen specifically for their emotional impact rather than their descriptive accuracy. These words trigger strong feelings that make people more likely to support policies or actions without careful analysis of their actual content or consequences. Sales environments use emotional triggers constantly. Words like exclusive, limited, breakthrough, or guaranteed are selected for their ability to trigger excitement, fear of missing out, or feelings of special treatment. The goal is to create emotional states where logical evaluation of price, quality, or necessity becomes secondary to the immediate emotional response. Social media platforms and news organizations often use emotional triggering to increase engagement. Headlines are crafted to provoke outrage, excitement, fear, or curiosity because content that triggers strong emotions gets more clicks, shares, and comments. This creates an environment where emotional manipulation becomes a standard business practice. In workplace settings, emotional triggering might involve using words related to loyalty, team spirit, or professional success to encourage compliance with unreasonable demands. We're counting on you. This is what separates high performers from average employees, or, I thought you were more committed than this, are all examples of language designed to trigger emotional responses that lead to agreement. Religious and spiritual contexts sometimes employ emotional triggering through language related to salvation, damnation, divine approval, or spiritual enlightenment. These concepts can trigger intense emotional states that make followers more susceptible to other forms of influence and less likely to question teachings or demands. The timing of emotional triggers is often strategic. A manipulator might wait until their target is already stressed, tired, or emotionally vulnerable before introducing triggering language. In these weakened states, people are more susceptible to emotional manipulation and less able to maintain psychological defenses. What makes emotional triggering particularly effective is that the triggered emotions feel entirely genuine and justified. The person experiencing them often doesn't realize that their emotional state has been artificially induced for someone else's benefit. They believe their strong feelings are natural responses to the situation, not manufactured reactions to deliberately chosen words. Recognizing emotional triggering involves developing awareness of your own emotional patterns and triggers. If you find yourself having unusually strong emotional reactions during certain conversations, especially ones where someone is making requests or trying to influence you, it's worth considering whether specific words or concepts are being used deliberately to provoke those feelings. It's also helpful to notice when someone seems to have unusual insight into what words or topics create strong reactions in you, and whether they tend to bring up these topics when they want something from you. While people naturally learn about each other's sensitivities in relationships, using that knowledge strategically for manipulation crosses an important line. The antidote to emotional triggering is developing the habit of pausing when you feel intense emotions, especially during important conversations or decision-making moments. This pause allows your rational mind to catch up with your emotional response and evaluate whether your feelings are proportionate to the actual situation or whether they might be artificially amplified. Understanding emotional triggering doesn't mean suppressing all emotions or becoming cold and analytical. Emotions provide valuable information and motivation, but it does mean maintaining awareness that your emotional responses can be influenced by others' word choices, and that decisions made in highly emotional states may not reflect your best judgment or genuine interests. 14. Love withdrawal. Withhold affection until demands are met. Love withdrawal, also known as emotional withholding, is a manipulation technique where affection, attention, warmth, or emotional connection is deliberately removed as punishment for not complying with someone's demands or expectations. Unlike direct confrontation or argument, this method uses the absence of positive emotional connection as a tool for control, creating anxiety and desperation that often leads to compliance. The technique works by exploiting our fundamental need for emotional connection and approval, especially from people we care about. When someone we love suddenly becomes cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable, it triggers deep-seated fears of abandonment and rejection. These feelings are often so uncomfortable that we become willing to change our behavior, suppress our needs, or agree to unreasonable demands just to restore the emotional connection. Love withdrawal typically begins when someone doesn't get what they want. Instead of directly discussing the issue or accepting the other person's boundaries, they shift their entire emotional demeanor. Warmth disappears, conversation becomes minimal and cold, physical affection stops, and they may even act as if the other person doesn't exist. This dramatic change in emotional climate creates immediate distress for the person on the receiving end. In romantic relationships, love withdrawal might follow a partner's refusal to do something, expression of different opinions, or attempt to maintain independence. The withdrawing partner doesn't argue or explain their displeasure directly. Instead, they simply become emotionally unavailable. No more affectionate texts, no more intimate conversations, no more physical closeness. The message is clear. Compliance restores love, resistance removes it. Parent-child relationships sometimes involve love withdrawal, though it's particularly damaging when used against children. A parent might become cold and distant when a child doesn't meet their expectations, creating the impression that parental love is conditional on specific behaviors. This can create lasting psychological effects, including difficulty trusting relationships and chronic fear of abandonment. Friendship dynamics can also involve love withdrawal, where someone becomes distant and cold when their friend doesn't prioritize them sufficiently, agree with their opinions, or meet their emotional needs. The withdrawing friend might stop initiating contact, become brief and unresponsive in communication, or exclude the other person from activities, all without directly explaining what's wrong. In workplace relationships, love withdrawal might involve a supervisor becoming distant and unresponsive when an employee doesn't show sufficient enthusiasm for extra work, challenges a decision, or maintains work-life boundaries. The supervisor doesn't directly punish the employee, but their withdrawal of professional warmth and support creates pressure for compliance. What makes love withdrawal particularly cruel is its ambiguity. The person experiencing it often isn't sure what they did wrong or how to fix the situation. The withdrawing party typically refuses to discuss the issue directly, leaving the other person to guess at what caused the change and what might restore the connection. This uncertainty amplifies anxiety and makes compliance seem like the only path to resolution. The technique often involves intermittent reinforcement, occasional moments of warmth mixed with continued coldness. These brief returns to normal emotional connection provide hope that the relationship can be repaired, making the person more likely to continue trying to earn back the withheld affection. The unpredictability of when warmth might return creates an addictive cycle of pursuit and temporary reward. Love withdrawal differs from legitimate emotional distance that might occur after genuine hurt or conflict. Healthy emotional distance usually involves communication about what's wrong and what's needed for resolution. Manipulative love withdrawal deliberately avoids communication and uses emotional absence as a weapon to force compliance rather than seeking genuine resolution. The long-term effects of repeated love withdrawal can be severe. People who experience it regularly often develop hypervigilance about others' emotional states, constantly monitoring for signs of displeasure that might lead to emotional abandonment. They may become overly compliant, suppressing their own needs and opinions to avoid triggering withdrawal. This pattern can also create relationship addiction, where the person becomes dependent on the emotional highs that come when affection is restored. The contrast between withdrawal and return creates intense relief and gratitude that can feel like deep love, even when the relationship is fundamentally unhealthy. Recognizing love withdrawal involves paying attention to patterns rather than isolated incidents. If someone consistently becomes emotionally distant when you don't meet their expectations, express different opinions, or maintain boundaries, and if this distance is resolved only when you comply with their wishes, you're likely experiencing this manipulation technique. It's also important to notice whether emotional conflicts in your relationships involve communication and resolution or just punishment and compliance. Healthy relationships work through disagreements by talking, understanding different perspectives, and finding mutually acceptable solutions. Manipulative relationships use emotional punishment to force one person to surrender their position. The key to protecting yourself from love withdrawal is maintaining your emotional independence and recognizing that genuine love doesn't disappear when you have different opinions, needs, or boundaries. Real affection might be strained by conflict, but it doesn't vanish entirely just because you don't comply with someone's demands. Understanding this technique also means recognizing that you have the right to maintain your own emotional stability regardless of someone else's approval. While relationships require compromise and consideration, they shouldn't require you to abandon your own needs and boundaries just to maintain emotional connection. 15. Repetition. Repeat ideas to implant beliefs subconsciously. Repetition is one of the most fundamental and powerful techniques in psychological manipulation. The principle is simple. Ideas that are repeated frequently, even without supporting evidence, gradually become more believable and acceptable. This happens because our brains are designed to recognize patterns and familiarity as indicators of truth and safety. When we hear something repeatedly, it begins to feel familiar, and familiarity often translates into credibility, regardless of the actual validity of the information. The effectiveness of repetition operates below conscious awareness. We might consciously notice that someone is repeating certain phrases or concepts, but the psychological impact occurs at a subconscious level where our brain is constantly processing and categorizing information. Each repetition strengthens neural pathways associated with the repeated idea, making it feel more natural, true, and acceptable over time. In advertising, repetition is used to build brand recognition and create positive associations with products. You might hear the same jingle, see the same slogan, or encounter the same product placement hundreds of times across different media. Even if you consciously dismiss these advertisements, the repeated exposure creates subconscious familiarity that can influence purchasing decisions when you're actually in a buying situation. Political propaganda relies heavily on repetition to shape public opinion. Slogans, talking points, and key phrases are repeated across multiple platforms, speakers, and contexts until they become part of the collective consciousness. Make America Great Again, Yes We Can, or Brexit means Brexit, become more than just political phrases. They become familiar concepts that feel important and true simply because of their repetitive presence in public discourse. In personal relationships, manipulative repetition might involve consistently reinforcing certain ideas about you, the relationship, or the world. Someone might repeatedly tell you that you're too sensitive, that no one else would put up with you, or that this is just how relationships work. Over time, these repeated messages can reshape your self-perception and expectations, even if they don't reflect reality. Religious and ideological indoctrination often uses repetition through daily prayers, repeated creeds, regular meetings where the same concepts are reinforced, or constant exposure to similar messages from multiple sources within the community. The goal is to make certain beliefs feel so familiar and natural that questioning them becomes uncomfortable or unthinkable. Workplace manipulation might involve repeatedly reinforcing messages about company culture, expectations, or your role. We're like a family here, going above and beyond is what we do, or this is a high-performance environment, might be repeated in meetings, emails, and casual conversations until these concepts become accepted as fundamental truths about the workplace, even when they're used to justify unreasonable demands. Social media and digital environments are particularly effective at repetitive influence because they can deliver the same messages through multiple channels and formats. An idea might appear as a news headline, a social media post, a video title, an advertisement, and a discussion topic, creating the impression of widespread agreement or importance even when it's actually coordinated repetition from the same source. The technique becomes more powerful when the repetition comes from multiple sources or appears in different contexts. If you hear the same idea from your partner, see it in an article they share, encounter it in a movie you watch together, and hear it mentioned by their friends, the convergence of sources makes the repeated idea seem validated by independent confirmation rather than coordinated reinforcement. Timing enhances the effectiveness of repetition. Ideas repeated during moments of stress, fatigue, or emotional vulnerability are more likely to be accepted without critical analysis. Someone might consistently repeat certain messages when you're tired after work, during arguments when your defenses are down, or during intimate moments when your trust is heightened. What makes repetition particularly insidious is that it doesn't require the repeated ideas to be logical, beneficial, or true. Simply hearing something frequently enough can make it feel credible and important. This is why fact-checking and critical thinking are essential. Our natural tendency to trust familiar ideas can override our analytical judgment. The psychological principle behind repetition is called the mere exposure effect, or familiarity bias. We tend to prefer things we've encountered before, even when we can't consciously remember those encounters. This applies to ideas, people, products, and concepts. Familiarity breeds comfort and acceptance, not contempt. Recognizing manipulative repetition involves paying attention to what ideas, phrases, or concepts someone consistently brings up in conversation. If you find yourself starting to accept or believe things that you initially questioned, especially when those beliefs primarily benefit the person who keeps repeating them, you might be experiencing the cumulative effect of repetitive influence. It's also worth noticing when the same messages appear across multiple areas of your life, from the same person through different channels, or from seemingly different sources that might actually be coordinated. The appearance of independent confirmation can mask deliberate repetitive manipulation. The antidote to repetitive manipulation is conscious awareness and deliberate fact-checking. When you notice that certain ideas feel familiar or true primarily because you've heard them repeatedly, it's worth stepping back to evaluate them independently. Ask yourself whether you have actual evidence for these beliefs, whether they serve your interests, and whether you would accept them if you were hearing them for the first time. Understanding repetition doesn't mean becoming suspicious of all repeated information. Many true and important ideas do need to be repeated to be learned and remembered. But it does mean maintaining awareness that frequency of exposure doesn't equal validity, and that your sense of what's true and important can be artificially shaped by deliberate repetitive influence. 16. Mirroring. Copy body language or speech to build rapport subconsciously. Mirroring is the subtle practice of copying another person's body language, speech patterns, gestures, or mannerisms to create an unconscious sense of connection and trust. This technique exploits our natural tendency to feel more comfortable and connected with people who seem similar to us. When someone mirrors our behavior, it triggers a subconscious feeling that they understand us, share our perspective, or are naturally compatible with us, even when this similarity is artificially created. The power of mirroring lies in its operation below conscious awareness. Most people don't consciously notice when someone is copying their posture, matching their speaking pace, or adopting their gestures. Instead, they simply experience a growing sense of comfort and rapport with the person doing the mirroring. This makes mirroring particularly effective for building trust quickly and gaining influence without triggering suspicion or resistance. Natural mirroring happens spontaneously in healthy relationships and social interactions. When people genuinely connect, they often unconsciously begin to match each other's energy levels, speaking patterns, or physical positions. This organic synchronization is a sign of mutual comfort and engagement. But when mirroring is used deliberately as a manipulation technique, it creates artificial rapport designed to lower defenses and increase compliance. In sales environments, trained professionals often use mirroring to build quick connections with potential customers. They might match the customer's sitting position, speaking volume, or hand gestures while presenting their product. If a customer speaks slowly and thoughtfully, the salesperson adopts a similar pace. If the customer is energetic and animated, the salesperson becomes more dynamic. This artificial synchronization makes customers feel understood and creates trust that can lead to purchasing decisions. Romantic manipulation often involves mirroring interests, values, or communication styles to create the illusion of perfect compatibility. Someone might research their target's hobbies and suddenly develop similar interests, adopt their political views, or begin using their favorite phrases and expressions. This creates the intoxicating feeling of having found someone who gets them completely, when in reality they're interacting with a carefully constructed reflection of themselves. In workplace settings, manipulative colleagues or supervisors might use mirroring to build alliances or gain compliance. They might adopt your communication style during important conversations, match your concerns and priorities when discussing projects, or even copy your professional mannerisms to create a sense of shared perspective that makes their requests seem more reasonable. Therapeutic and counseling relationships sometimes involve appropriate mirroring as a tool for building rapport and helping clients feel understood. But in manipulative contexts, this same technique can be used to exploit vulnerability and gain inappropriate influence over someone seeking help or guidance. Digital communication has created new forms of mirroring, where someone might adopt your texting style, use similar emojis, or mirror your posting patterns on social media. They might like the same content you engage with, share similar opinions, or even adjust their online personality to match yours. This creates artificial common ground that can be used to build trust for later manipulation. Political and ideological manipulation often involves mirroring the values, concerns, or communication styles of target audiences. A manipulative leader might adopt the speech patterns, cultural references, or emotional tone of different groups they're trying to influence, creating the impression that they naturally understand and represent those constituencies. What makes mirroring particularly effective is that it triggers reciprocal behavior. When someone mirrors us, we often unconsciously begin to mirror them back, creating a cycle of artificial synchronization that deepens the sense of connection. This mutual mirroring can create powerful feelings of bonding and understanding, even when the relationship is fundamentally based on manipulation. The technique also exploits our psychological tendency toward consistency and reciprocity. When we feel connected to someone, we're more likely to want to help them, agree with them, or give them what they want. Mirroring creates these feelings of connection artificially, leading to compliance that serves the manipulator's interests rather than genuine mutual benefit. Skilled manipulators often combine mirroring with other techniques, using the rapport they've built to introduce requests, suggestions, or influence attempts. Once someone feels deeply understood and connected, they are more likely to accept guidance, make sacrifices, or agree to things they might otherwise reject. The timing of mirroring is often strategic. A manipulator might mirror someone most intensely during moments of vulnerability, decision-making, or emotional openness, when the artificial rapport can have maximum impact on judgment and decision-making. Recognizing manipulative mirroring involves paying attention to how quickly someone seems to understand you or share your perspectives, especially when that understanding emerges very early in the relationship. While genuine compatibility does exist, it usually develops gradually as people actually get to know each other, not immediately upon meeting. It's also worth noticing if someone's behavior, interests, or communication style seems to shift to match yours, particularly if these changes happen quickly or seem to align too perfectly with your preferences. Authentic personality traits tend to be consistent across different relationships and contexts, while manipulative mirroring tends to be specifically tailored to each target. Another red flag is when someone seems to have unusually detailed knowledge about your interests, concerns, or communication preferences without you having shared that information directly. This might indicate that they've researched you to enable more effective mirroring. The key to protecting yourself from manipulative mirroring is maintaining awareness that genuine compatibility and understanding develop over time through shared experiences and honest communication. While it's natural to feel drawn to people who seem similar to you, it's worth questioning relationships where that similarity emerges very quickly or seems almost too perfect to be coincidental. Understanding mirroring doesn't mean becoming paranoid about everyone who shares your interests or communication style. Many genuine connections do involve natural similarities and synchronization, but it does mean paying attention to whether someone's apparent compatibility with you is consistent over time and across different situations, or whether it seems artificially maintained to influence your behavior and decisions. 17. Pattern interrupts. Disrupt someone's mental process to make them suggestible. Pattern interrupts are sudden disruptions of expected mental or behavioral sequences designed to create momentary confusion and increased suggestibility. When our brain is following a predictable pattern, whether in thought, conversation, or behavior, and that pattern is suddenly broken, we experience a brief moment of disorientation where our conscious defenses are lowered. Manipulators exploit these moments to insert suggestions, requests, or influences that might otherwise be rejected. The technique works because our brains constantly create expectations based on patterns and context. When we're in a familiar situation following a predictable sequence, our conscious mind relaxes slightly, operating on mental autopilot while focusing attention elsewhere. When that expected pattern is suddenly broken, our brain needs a moment to recalibrate, during which we become more receptive to external suggestions and less likely to analyze them critically. In conversation, pattern interrupts might involve sudden topic changes, unexpected questions, or deliberate confusion in the middle of what seemed like a straightforward discussion. Someone might be explaining their position on an important topic when the other person suddenly asks, "Wait, what time is it?" or makes a completely unrelated observation. This breaks the speaker's train of thought and creates a moment of mental vulnerability. Sales professionals often use pattern interrupts to disrupt customer resistance. When someone is building up reasons not to make a purchase, the salesperson might suddenly compliment their appearance, ask about something unrelated, or create a small distraction that breaks the customer's logical thought process. In that moment of confusion, they quickly insert their closing request or final persuasion attempt. Physical pattern interrupts involve unexpected touches, gestures, or movements that break the flow of interaction. A handshake that lasts too long, an unexpected hug, or even standing up suddenly during a seated conversation can create moments of disorientation that make the other person more suggestible to whatever comes next. In romantic manipulation, pattern interrupts might be used during arguments or serious conversations. Just when someone is making an important point or expressing a concern, their partner might suddenly become affectionate, make a joke, or redirect attention to something else entirely. This prevents the completion of difficult conversations and can make the interrupted person doubt the importance of what they were saying. Hypnotic and therapeutic contexts sometimes use pattern interrupts as legitimate tools for breaking negative thought cycles or creating openings for positive suggestions. But in manipulative hands, the same techniques are used to disrupt critical thinking and insert influences that serve the manipulator's agenda rather than the subject's well-being. Digital environments create opportunities for pattern interrupts through notifications, pop-ups, or sudden changes in content that disrupt focused attention. Someone might be reading something important or making a decision when a notification, advertisement, or message breaks their concentration, creating a moment where they're more susceptible to whatever appears next on their screen. Group dynamics often involve pattern interrupts where expected social sequences are deliberately broken to create confusion and increase compliance. During meetings, someone might suddenly change the format, introduce unexpected elements, or break normal discussion patterns to prevent organized resistance to their proposals. Workplace manipulation might use pattern interrupts during important conversations about boundaries, compensation, or working conditions. Just when an employee is building a case for their position, The supervisor might suddenly shift to personal topics, create distractions, or break the flow in ways that make it difficult to maintain focus on the original issue. What makes pattern interrupts particularly effective is that they often seem accidental or natural rather than deliberate. The person experiencing them usually doesn't recognize that their thought process has been intentionally disrupted. They simply notice that they've lost their train of thought or feel confused about what they were saying, making them more likely to accept guidance about what to think or do next. The technique also exploits our social tendency to be polite and accommodating when unexpected things happen. When someone interrupts our mental process, we often try to be understanding about the disruption rather than insisting on returning to our original thought, especially if the interrupt seems to be unintentional or socially motivated. Timing is crucial for effective pattern interrupts. They need to occur at moments when the person's mental process is flowing smoothly and predictably, so the disruption creates maximum disorientation. Interrupting someone who's already confused or distracted won't have the same effect as interrupting clear, focused thinking. Recognizing pattern interrupts involves paying attention to disruptions that occur during important conversations, decision-making moments, or when you're expressing concerns or resistance. If you frequently find yourself losing your train of thought, feeling confused about what you were saying, or being redirected away from topics you intended to discuss, you might be experiencing deliberate pattern interruption. It's particularly worth noticing if someone seems to have a talent for creating distractions or changing subjects at moments when you're building up to important points or making cases for your position. While some interruptions are genuinely accidental or socially motivated, consistent disruption of your thought processes might be a manipulation technique. The antidote to pattern interrupts is developing the habit of pausing to reconnect with your original thought or intention when you notice you've been interrupted or distracted. Instead of simply flowing with the new direction, take a moment to remember what you were thinking about before the interruption and decide whether you want to continue with that train of thought. Understanding pattern interrupts doesn't mean becoming rigid about conversation flow or suspicious of every distraction. Natural conversations do involve topic changes and unexpected elements. But it does mean maintaining awareness of your own mental processes and your right to complete important thoughts and discussions, even when interruptions occur. 18. Plausible deniability. Deny, distort, or deflect blame to confuse. Plausible deniability is a manipulation technique where someone structures their actions, statements, or behaviors in ways that allow them to avoid accountability while maintaining the appearance of innocence. The key word is plausible. The denials don't have to be true, they just have to be believable enough that others can't prove wrongdoing or malicious intent. This technique allows manipulators to cause harm while protecting themselves from consequences. The power of plausible deniability lies in its ability to exploit the benefit of the doubt that most people naturally extend to others. When someone denies wrongdoing in a way that seems possible, even if unlikely, many people prefer to believe the denial rather than confront the uncomfortable possibility that they're dealing with deliberate manipulation. This social tendency to avoid conflict helps manipulators escape accountability. In personal relationships, plausible deniability might involve making hurtful comments that can be explained away as jokes, misunderstandings, or innocent observations. "I was just kidding, you're being too sensitive," or "that's not what I meant at all," become standard responses to any attempt to address harmful behavior. The manipulator creates just enough ambiguity that their targets begin to doubt their own perceptions. The technique often involves careful word choice and timing. A manipulator might make subtle insults disguised as compliments, ask invasive questions framed as concern, or make demands that sound like suggestions. When confronted, they can point to the literal interpretation of their words while denying any harmful intent behind them. Workplace manipulation frequently uses plausible deniability to avoid harassment or discrimination claims. Comments about someone's appearance, capabilities, or background are carefully crafted to sound professional or even supportive while carrying undermining messages. If challenged, the perpetrator can claim they were being helpful, giving feedback, or simply making observations. Digital communication makes plausible deniability easier because tone and intent are harder to prove in text messages, emails, or social media posts. Someone might make threatening or manipulative statements that can be explained away as misunderstandings, autocorrect errors, or taken out of context. The lack of nonverbal cues makes it easier to deny harmful intent. Political figures often use plausible deniability by making statements that can be interpreted multiple ways, allowing them to appeal to different audiences while maintaining the ability to deny any specific meaning if challenged. Dog whistles, coded language that seems innocent to general audiences but carries specific meaning to target groups, are a classic example of this technique. In group settings, manipulators might use plausible deniability by making harmful statements or decisions that can be attributed to group consensus, external pressures, or organizational requirements. "This wasn't my idea, everyone agreed to this," or "I'm just following policy," allow individuals to avoid personal responsibility for actions they actively promoted or decided. Financial and business manipulation often relies on plausible deniability through complex structures, vague language, or technical loopholes that allow harmful practices while maintaining legal protection. Contracts, agreements, or policies are written in ways that can be interpreted to benefit the manipulator while giving them grounds to deny any intent to deceive or harm. What makes plausible deniability particularly frustrating for targets is that it makes them appear paranoid or overly suspicious when they try to address the manipulation. Since the manipulator can always point to innocent explanations for their behavior, calling them out risks making the victim look unreasonable or accusatory. The technique also creates cumulative psychological damage over time. Each individual incident might seem minor or explainable, but the pattern creates significant stress and confusion for the target. They begin to doubt their own perceptions and judgment, wondering if they're imagining problems or being too sensitive. Manipulators often prepare their deniability in advance, thinking through how they can explain away their actions if confronted. They might create witnesses, documentation, or circumstances that support their innocent explanations, making their deniability seem more credible when challenged. The gaslighting effect of plausible deniability can be severe. When someone consistently denies behavior that clearly occurred, while providing explanations that seem just possible enough to be true, their targets often begin to question their own memory, judgment, and sanity. This self-doubt makes them less likely to challenge future manipulation. Recognizing plausible deniability involves paying attention to patterns rather than individual incidents. While any single event might have an innocent explanation, a consistent pattern of behavior that requires constant explanation and denial is more likely to indicate deliberate manipulation than coincidental misunderstandings. It's also worth noticing if someone seems unusually prepared with explanations for their behavior, especially explanations that minimize their responsibility or reframe harmful actions as misunderstandings. While people do sometimes genuinely miscommunicate or act unintentionally, manipulators often have remarkably convenient explanations ready for every problematic behavior. The key to protecting yourself from plausible deniability manipulation is trusting your own perceptions and experiences, even when someone provides explanations that sound reasonable. If behavior consistently feels harmful or wrong to you, that matters regardless of how well someone can explain it away. Understanding this technique also means recognizing that you don't need absolute proof of malicious intent to protect yourself from harmful behavior. Even if someone's explanations are technically possible, you still have the right to set boundaries around behavior that affects you negatively, regardless of the stated intentions behind it. 19. Playing the victim. Make yourself the victim to gain sympathy and control. Playing the victim is a manipulation technique where someone consistently portrays themselves as wronged, misunderstood, or unfairly treated in order to gain sympathy, avoid accountability, and control the behavior of others. This technique exploits our natural compassion and desire to help those who are suffering, redirecting attention away from the manipulator's harmful behavior and toward their claimed victimization. The power of victim playing lies in its ability to flip the script in any conflict or confrontation. Instead of addressing their own actions or taking responsibility for problems they've created, the manipulator immediately shifts focus to how they've been hurt, misunderstood, or treated unfairly. This puts the other person in a position where they feel guilty for bringing up concerns and compelled to provide comfort rather than seeking resolution. In romantic relationships, victim playing often emerges when someone is confronted about harmful behavior. Instead of acknowledging the harm they've caused, they immediately begin talking about how hurt they are, how misunderstood they feel, or how unfairly they're being treated. "I can't believe you would say that to me," or "I thought you cared about me more than this." Redirect the conversation from their behavior to their emotional state. The technique is particularly effective because it triggers caretaking instincts in empathetic people. When someone we care about appears to be suffering, our natural response is to provide comfort and support. Victim-playing manipulators exploit this response by consistently presenting themselves as wounded parties, even when they're the ones causing problems in the relationship. Workplace victim-playing might involve someone consistently claiming they're being picked on, misunderstood, or treated unfairly whenever their performance or behavior is questioned. They might frame feedback as personal attacks, present legitimate consequences as persecution, or claim that others are conspiring against them. This makes colleagues and supervisors hesitant to address genuine issues for fear of appearing unsympathetic. The professional victim often has a history of conflicts with others that they attribute to jealousy, misunderstanding, or unfair treatment. They present themselves as perpetually wronged by bosses, colleagues, family members, or romantic partners, never acknowledging their own role in these repeated conflicts. In family dynamics, victim playing can be used to avoid responsibility while maintaining control over others' behavior. A parent might respond to their adult child's boundaries by talking about how hurt and abandoned they feel, rather than respecting the boundary. This forces the child to choose between maintaining their boundary and providing emotional comfort to their parent. Social media environments provide rich opportunities for victim playing through posts that consistently portray the author as wronged by others. These might include vague references to being misunderstood, betrayed, or treated unfairly, designed to generate sympathy and support from followers without providing context that might reveal the author's role in their difficulties. What makes victim playing particularly manipulative is its preemptive nature. Skilled victim players often portray themselves as suffering before anyone has even raised concerns about their behavior. This creates an emotional environment where others feel guilty for having any negative thoughts or feelings about the manipulator. The technique also involves selective memory and narrative distortion. Victim players consistently remember and emphasize times they were hurt while minimizing or forgetting times they caused hurt to others. They reframe their own aggressive or harmful behavior as creates several harmful dynamics in relationships. Others begin walking on eggshells to avoid triggering emotional displays. Genuine issues never get addressed because discussions always pivot to the manipulator's hurt feelings, and the emotional energy of the relationship becomes focused on managing the victim player's constant distress. The manipulator often combines victim playing with other techniques like guilt tripping and emotional blackmail. They might threaten self-harm, talk about how alone they feel, or suggest that others' lack of support is causing them severe distress. These escalations make it even harder for others to maintain boundaries or address problematic behavior. Professional victim players often seek out sympathetic audiences who will validate their victim narrative without questioning it. They might have multiple people in their lives who see them as perpetually wronged and who provide constant emotional support without recognizing the manipulative pattern. Recognizing victim playing involves paying attention to whether someone consistently portrays themselves as wronged in every conflict or difficult situation. While people do sometimes genuinely experience unfair treatment, consistent victim narratives that never include any self-reflection or acknowledgement of personal responsibility are red flags for manipulation. It's also worth noticing if discussions about someone's behavior consistently get redirected to their emotional pain or feelings of victimization. Healthy accountability involves acknowledging when we've hurt others, not immediately shifting focus to our own suffering. The key pattern to identify is the absence of genuine accountability. Real victims of unfair treatment can usually acknowledge times when they've also made mistakes or contributed to problems. Manipulative victim players rarely, if ever, take genuine responsibility for their role in conflicts or difficulties. Understanding victim playing doesn't mean becoming unsympathetic to others' pain or refusing to provide emotional support when people are genuinely struggling. But it does mean recognizing that consistent victim narratives, especially ones that emerge whenever accountability is sought, might be manipulation techniques rather than genuine expressions of suffering. The protection against victim playing manipulation is maintaining your right to address legitimate concerns about someone's behavior, regardless of how much emotional distress they express in response. Genuine care for others includes helping them grow and improve, not just providing endless sympathy that enables harmful behavior to continue. 20. Triangulation. Insert a third party to manipulate emotions. Triangulation is a manipulation technique where a third person or entity is brought into a two-person conflict or relationship dynamic to create competition, jealousy, confusion, or emotional manipulation. Instead of addressing issues directly between the people involved, the manipulator introduces external references, comparisons, or relationships to gain leverage and control. This technique transforms straightforward interpersonal dynamics into complex emotional triangles that serve the manipulator's interests. The power of triangulation lies in its ability to exploit fundamental human emotions like jealousy, insecurity, and fear of abandonment. When someone introduces a third party into a relationship discussion, whether real or imagined, it immediately shifts the emotional landscape from focusing on the actual issue to managing feelings about this external threat or comparison. This emotional disruption often makes people more compliant and less likely to maintain their original position. In romantic relationships, triangulation might involve a partner mentioning how understanding their ex-partner was, how much easier their relationship with a friend is, or how attractive they find someone else. These references aren't usually direct threats, but they create anxiety and competition that make the other person work harder to secure the relationship, often by suppressing their own needs or concerns. The technique can also involve using family members, friends, or colleagues as validators or weapons in disputes. "My mother thinks you're being unreasonable," or "Everyone at work agrees with me about this," transforms a personal disagreement into a perceived group consensus against one person. This creates social pressure and isolation that can force compliance. Workplace triangulation often involves supervisors or colleagues bringing up comparisons to other employees, other departments, or industry standards to manipulate behavior. "The team in the other office never complains about working weekends," or "Sarah is always willing to take on extra projects," creates competition and pressure to conform without directly demanding compliance. Parental triangulation can involve using one child to send messages to another, comparing children to each other, or bringing children into adult conflicts. "Your brother never gives me this much trouble," or "Tell your father I'm too upset to talk to him," puts children in the middle of dynamics they shouldn't be responsible for managing. Social triangulation might involve introducing real or fabricated social pressures, comparisons to peer groups, or references to what normal people do in similar situations. This creates pressure to conform to external standards rather than making decisions based on personal values and preferences. Digital environments enable triangulation through social media comparisons, online relationships, or references to virtual communities. Someone might consistently mention their online friends, compare their partner to people they follow on social media, or use their digital relationships to create jealousy or insecurity in offline relationships. What makes triangulation particularly manipulative is that it often involves people or standards that can't be directly consulted or challenged. The third party might be an ex-partner who isn't present to clarify their actual opinions, a generalized group like everyone, or most people, or abstract standards that can't be objectively verified. The technique also exploits our natural tendency to want to be seen as reasonable and likable. When someone suggests that others would handle a situation differently or that we're being unreasonable compared to some standard, we often feel pressure to adjust our behavior to align with these external expectations, even when they might not be accurate or relevant. Triangulation creates several harmful dynamics. It prevents direct, honest communication between the people actually involved in the conflict. It introduces irrelevant comparisons that distract from the real issues. It creates insecurity and competition that can damage self-esteem and confidence. And it gives the manipulator power by positioning them as the spokesperson for external opinions and standards. The technique is often combined with other manipulation methods. Someone might use triangulation to create insecurity, then offer themselves as the solution to that insecurity. Or they might use external comparisons to justify unreasonable demands, making those demands seem normal and acceptable. Recognizing triangulation involves paying attention to when conversations about your relationship or behavior consistently include references to other people, relationships, or external standards. While outside perspectives can sometimes be valuable, manipulative triangulation typically introduces these references to create pressure and competition rather than genuine insight. It's also worth noticing if someone seems to have unusual access to opinions from others about your private relationship or personal choices. Manipulators often fabricate or exaggerate external opinions to support their position, claiming knowledge about what others think that they couldn't realistically have. The key red flag is when third-party references are consistently used to pressure you rather than inform you. Legitimate outside perspectives are usually offered as additional information to consider, while manipulative triangulation presents external opinions as evidence that you're wrong and need to change. Understanding triangulation means recognizing that your relationships and decisions should primarily be based on the people directly involved, not on real or imagined external opinions. While it's natural to consider what others might think, allowing those considerations to override your own judgment and values often serves manipulative purposes rather than your genuine well-being. The protection against triangulation is maintaining focus on the actual people and issues involved in any situation, asking for direct communication rather than accepting second-hand reports about others' opinions, and making decisions based on your own values and the actual dynamics at play rather than comparisons to external standards or relationships.